It is good to see all of you again. I know that many of you have been busy working with Paul and others on some of the financial issues that we continue to confront the economy. We're pleased that we've seen some progress, that there is some return to normalcy in certain aspects of the financial markets. We think that will be helpful overall. But obviously one of the things that I've been concerned about since I took office is looking beyond the immediate crisis in front of us to find out what is a sustainable economic model post-bubble and bust. How do we create sound fundamentals on issues like education, on healthcare, and the topic that we're going to discuss today, energy, as well as all the innovation that's required around these various areas, so that moving forward, we don't find ourselves in an unsustainable economic model. And we have seen this week some fairly extraordinary steps being taken around energy, which are promising. Yesterday, I stood out in the Rose Garden and announced that the automakers, the unions, state and local officials, as well as the federal government, were coming up with a uniform national fuel efficiency standard that will provide certainty to the automakers and take a real bite out of our level of oil imports and over time reduce our dependency on foreign oil. At the same time, you've got an energy committee in the House of Representatives which is making more progress than we would have ever expected around the issue of greenhouse gases and carbon pollution. So you're seeing industry, labor, and government working together more cooperatively in a better spirit than we've seen in a very long time. But this is a huge, complicated, difficult issue. I know that sometimes the slogans about clean energy and green energy may be a little more forward-leaning than the realities of the numbers of jobs that are currently being produced or the technologies that are currently available. And so one of the roles that I thought we could play today is to try to flesh out a little bit what can we get done, where are immediate opportunities that we should be taking advantage of, what are some major challenges, how realistic are some of our projections around clean energy, and how much of them are dependent on technological breakthroughs that we don't yet foresee, and how does this affect those who are not in the energy sectors but have nevertheless a significant interest in how this will affect overall economic growth. So I wanted to start with John Doerr, who's done as much work on this as anybody as a venture capitalist, but somebody who sort of digs in and gets his hands dirty on these issues and understands the technology behind a lot of these questions. And John, why don't you share with us sort of more broadly how you're thinking about some of these issues?
Well, thank you for making energy and climate such a priority. It's today's discussion, and it's very important to everybody on the board. There's agreement in our group that energy touches everybody's lives, every activity in the country, and so it's very important for us to get this right. I put together a paper based on input from some members of this board. We're going to discuss it further today and this week and now. It's focused on the economic consequences of whether we act or do not act for America, and it speaks to jobs, and it also talks about something that we haven't heard much about to date, and that is how getting this right can have a large effect on America's worldwide economic leadership. And if we get it wrong, we're going to stay where we are today, which is not really in the race. You've taken a position, the administration's taken a position squarely in favor of a market-based system to deal with the costs of carbon and climate, the so-called cap-and-trade position. My sense from conversations, not a vote of our group, is that we favor that, though there are some differing opinions. We think it's very important to act now, that there's an issue with carbon emissions that we're behind where we want to be, behind other nations in the world in dealing with this. Also, if we act now and send very clear signals to our business community and the nation that we can get investment now that will create jobs now as this kind of a regime or system develops. We think that putting a price on carbon is the most important thing we can do, but it's not the only policy that should be adopted. Getting more work in research and development funding, that's an area that's been neglected. It is an important thing to do, and the Department of Energy, as part of the stimulus bill and others, is moving in that direction. We think enlisting our utilities nationwide, make them allies in getting more energy efficiency, is a very important step, and we've got more work to do there. And finally, making sure that our cars and our buildings are the most efficient in the world. The action that was taken yesterday is very important to a comprehensive solution to this climate crisis we're dealing with. I want to close with my views on an optimistic note, and that is that we are seeing breakthroughs in the technology that not only can get us where we need to be, but that can make sure that America is the worldwide leader in developing the jobs and the businesses and the wealth from this industry, as it was the case with the internet.
Jeff, do you want to talk about this from a big manufacturing company that both uses energy but also works on the technologies that might save energy usage?
You know, Mr. President, I think clean energy is the most exciting, fastest growth industry of the 21st century. We've got about 70 energy efficiency products, about $18 billion in revenue this year. We have 50,000 jobs between GE and our supply chain, lots of small and medium-sized companies in this country and around the world. Technology is out there to be had. I think we have to have a broad aspiration to lead in technology. It includes what I call big baseload technologies like coal gasification and nuclear, real advancement in renewables, technologies that drive efficiency like the smart grid, and it's out there to be had. The leadership is out there to be had. You know, this ought to be something that we aspire as a country to do. I think things that help that are actually a price for carbon and unleashing the technology that can be applied, as John said, to energy. If you go back 50 years in this country, the amount that's been spent in energy R&D is dwarfed by healthcare, NASA, other places. I think if we can take the ingenuity and the innovation of the United States, apply it to this technical revolution that's going to be going on, give us certainty, give industry certainty around a price for carbon or the rules of the road, I think we're going to be surprised by how many great jobs this creates. I would say these 50,000 jobs in this brutal recession are the most robust jobs we have. We're shipping products around the world. You know, we ship about 150 heavy-duty gas turbines. 3 will go to the U.S., 147 go to the rest of the world.
So this is
So when we
actually
do
an
it
area-
well.
This is an area where we could develop a strong export market.
I think we have to think about it that way, Mr. President. We've got to move now. Other countries around the world are doing the same things, and there's no reason why we should see leadership to other people.
How far behind are we technologically to other countries? John,
Look, I would say the innovation exists here. Europe's at 10% renewables, we're at 2 or 3%. Other nations of the world like China, Finland, France are building nuclear power. We haven't started yet. We're doing the first coal gasification plant in 25 years in Indiana. So the brains exist in this country. I think what we have to use is our domain to really build cost positions and competitiveness that can be globally competitive. But they're the types of products, Mr. President, that we can build great export industries around.
Rich, I know from a labor perspective, one of the big concerns you guys have is the decline in manufacturing.
Absolutely.
And we've actually got a task force that's working up some ideas about stabilizing and then growing our manufacturing base. This is one area where we're seeing some potential. I wonder if you just wanted to touch on sort of how the AFL-CIO is thinking about clean energy and its potential for creating solid middle-class jobs.
I think I could probably echo everything John said and what Jeff said. We see it as a tremendous, tremendous potential for us to lead. Our members are going back and being retrained to do weatherization, all sorts of green things to save energy, all type of new training to get them up to speed on the skills that they'll need. The problems that we're talking about, I think we are disadvantaged a little bit. We're disadvantaged by the tax code that your administration started looking at. We're disadvantaged in some ways by the trade agreements that your administration's already started looking at. And we look at, with the greening right now, we think a couple of things, a couple of trapdoors would actually look at. One is, we really think that this has to run on 2 tracks. Not only do we think it has to be done in this country, but simultaneously it has to be done internationally. Elsewise, the jobs that we create, we could ultimately lose because we're disadvantaged internationally if they don't. People that, like when the Kyoto Treaty was adopted, or at least asked to be adopted, everybody said we're disadvantaged by it, and so there was a lot of opposition. The other thing is, we think that all of this needs strict monitoring, so that while you're monitoring, you can tell if we're on course or not, and if we're not, we have to have language as a trapdoor so that the economy doesn't get derailed by surprise along the way. Our members are excited. We've already started creating the training programs and the jobs. They're already starting to help green the country, and we think it's a win-win-win for this country and for the people of this country. And we applaud you for your leadership in the area.
I want to open it up, but Martin, I'd be interested in your views on this. I mean, this is one of those areas where you can have some pretty fierce economic debates around the efficacy of a cap and trade versus a carbon tax, whether the government getting involved in this area helps significantly in sparking a clean energy revolution, or whether this is going to happen due to innovation in the private sector without government catalyzing it. And so to the extent that there's any skepticism in the room, and you're always good for that, I wanted to make sure that got put on the table and that we had a realistic conversation about some of these policies.
Well, I think a cap and trade or a carbon tax would undoubtedly stimulate conservation, green technology. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think about 2 aspects of this. One is the impact on consumers. There's a range of estimates, but the Markey Waxman kind of reduction, a 20% reduction from roughly current levels of CO2, the estimates run from $400 per capita increased cost to about $1,500. About 3/4 of the EPA is the low end, and an MIT technical study is the high end. About 3/4 of that is extra revenue that would go to the government. What's clear is you have to raise the price to consumers to get them to cut back. 3/4 of that would be revenue to the government that could be given
Repaid.
back
Right.
or could be used to support spending programs. The other quarter are real costs to put in place this
Right.
new technology. So I think it's very important in thinking about this to recognize the magnitude of that cost increase and the distribution. The other point is about whether you auction or give away some of these permits. The price has to go up by the same amount. The cost to the consumer has to go up by the same amount, whether you auction it off or you give it away.
Right.
And so I have a hard time understanding the giveaway strategy, because it seems to me that just says we'll take some of the money that would otherwise be collected by the government, that revenue, and give it to some of the firms that win this lottery to get some of these.
Well, as you know, during the campaign, my original proposal was a 100% auction, so that you didn't have the potential for political considerations or gaming of the system. The way I think that the Waxman-Markey bill is trying to address this is you've got regional differences that have to be accommodated. Some of it has to do with how do you, if not hold consumers harmless, then assure that the rebates or the allocations that are awarded are leveling out the cost to consumers. So it may not, it ends up not being as arbitrary as I think it might seem in the abstract. In the particulars, there are just some regions of the country, particularly in the Midwest and the South, where there are options for ramping up energy efficiencies quickly, are very different from California or some of the Northeast cities. And so you want them to make adjustments. On the other hand, if the adjustments are too onerous, too quick, not only is it brutal on those states, which are already having trouble, but politically it ends up being very difficult.
So this is for regulated electricity, basically.
Mostly around the electricity issue.
Because for gasoline and
For
for
gasoline,
other products.
That makes less sense. Now, I haven't seen all the details of the bill yet. Carol, you may end up having a better sense. Larry, do you want to chime in on this?
I think we had, having been taught by you when I was a student, Marty, I understood very well the.
Marty really doesn't like to admit to that, by the way.
No, I take great pride in my students. Larry, high on that list.
The principle, and I think the broad agreement that people in the business community discussed, and so forth, was the one the president articulated, which was in essence that the giveaways were to come in situations of which regulated electric utilities were the primary example, where you were going to be unable to pass on the price increase. There's a little bit of stuff that has the character of our companies in international competition, and there isn't something parallel happening in the world. So at least the principle was you don't get to pass it on and get the windfall. But in situations where it's not going to be passed on, then it's natural for there to be a compensation. You might disagree at some point on the application of the principle, but that is unambiguously the sort of economic principle that people are trying to pursue, and I think that's illogical.
And if I might just add, what Mr. Waxman has done to date in the bill is obviously still in markup and some things are still changing, is about 35% of the allowances that would have otherwise been auctioned are during a transition period given to the electric utilities, as the president said, to offset the impacts on consumers. Another 15% have been reserved for trade-sensitive, trade-intensive industries, recognizing that because of the global nature of their competition, there are some transition issues. And then some smaller amounts have been given to other sectors, including petroleum, but the bill is still under debate. But I do think there's this very clear understanding that these transitions are going to be an important way of helping industry find the kind of new technologies, the innovations that will allow us to ultimately drive down the cost.
Jim, you've got some thoughts as a big manufacturer that operates internationally. You probably see some of these opportunities, but I know you may see some risks as well.
Surprisingly.
Putting you at a competitive disadvantage. So.
surprisingly, I guess Caterpillar is the third largest producer of things that make kilowatts after GE and Siemens. We make small ones, but, and we're a big exporter also from the U.S. In fact, combined heat and power applications of both small turbines and small gensets are big sellers in actually more outside the United States than inside, partly because of the way we regulate emissions site-specific as opposed to looking at combined emissions and energy efficiency. So there are some things here that we could do to help our country be more competitive using the technologies that are out there. I agree with Jeff. I think we have the technology, we have the smarts here, and the product technologies, the economic incentives, what's needed. And that's why I think a lot of us in the industry support a clarity around a carbon price, because that's going to drive a lot of innovation and a lot of efficiency, and we'll get with the program of reducing carbon emissions. Our concern, and one of the things we've been very engaged with the U.S. CAP initiative discussing, is we need to approach this in an international context. I think if we move unilaterally as the United States with a significant cap and trade program that drives up the cost of carbon here significantly, and our international competitors, their countries, don't move with us, it's going to create competitive problems for the core, let's call it the base industry, steel, aluminum, cement, I mean the core feeder stock, if you will, for manufacturing industry in this country. But I think if we take that leadership role, as you articulated it, and go to the Copenhagen with that in hand as showing our commitment to move forward, I think there's a good chance that we'll find the Indians and the Chinese, for example, the two largest emerging markets and big growth markets, by the way, for U.S. exports, likely to want to work with us. And I think there's more opportunity for collaboration on an international scale than some people are giving us credit for here.
That's what we've been seeing.
Yeah, I think it's out there.
Yeah, well, I want to bring maybe some of the finance guys, because you crunch the numbers, you're looking for opportunities where it makes sense to invest, where it doesn't. Mark, how's this looking from a investor perspective?
Well, one way to think about it is to start and say, what's the size of the opportunity? And we produce about 1,000 gigawatts of energy, of electricity in the United States. Okay, so we've got 1,000. We're going to grow 1 or 2%, something like that a year. So by 2020, we're somewhere around 1,200. So that 200 increment, of that 1,000, by the way, 800 of it, of the 1,000, 800 of it is based on carbon, produces carbon emissions. So if we're growing another 200 and we're trying to get to 20%, one way to think about it is all of the new stuff has to be in alternatives. That's one way to, and it's about 20 gigawatts a year. That's a lot of money, that's a lot of capital required to produce 20 gigawatts. At the same time, we're in the middle of a credit crisis, and the big project financiers have been UBS, Banque Nationale Paris, all of RBS, all of the big European and Asian banks, all of them have pulled out of the market. So there's a natural disconnect between the amount of capital needed and the size of really big facilities, things that Jeff's talked about. And I think one thing we need to consider, it's a little bit built into the Waxman proposal, but we need to think through, is whether there's a role to attract private capital into those buildings, into that building initiative, and to have some role for the federal government. Because it does something that Marty is really focused on, I think appropriately. It drives down the cost. And the question is, what's the incremental cost to the consumer? What's the likelihood politically this is going to work? And if you can drive the cost down by having a more favorable capital structure, which has real risk from investors, but has a lower cost of aggregate capital, then you're going to increase the likelihood you actually, which is what your first question was, realistically hit these numbers. Because you're going to start building 20 a year, like soon, really soon, if you're going to make this goal work. Second thing I think that could really impact this is whether you have a national standard or not. I know the administration supports a national standard, national energy standard for alternatives. There's been real success on a state-by-state basis, but many states, as you pointed out earlier, don't have alternatives, don't have the ability to produce alternatives. If you're in the southeast, there's not a lot of, if you're in the southeast, there's not a lot of wind, there's not a lot of real sun power, so you're not going to see much alternative generation there. And energy moves across states. And so you've got to figure out a way, just as you're thinking through emissions for auto on a national basis, to think about a national standard for energy. I think if you did those two things, in addition to carbon, then you have a realistic likelihood of achieving the goals. If you don't have those three coming together, I think the likelihood is less, materially less.
Any of that, Marty?
Well, Mr. President, thank you. I'd like to point out three things, again, coming from finance. First, I think a number of people would say that once you think about not just the cost that Marty's raised, but also the benefit. And there's a general view, I think, among the economics profession that there's a net benefit of taking active efforts now to mitigate climate change, CO2 emissions, and this would be one element of it. Secondly, if we think about this from the standpoint of another part of finance, which is insurance, the insurance industry and reinsurance industry has seen insurance losses going up quite dramatically as a result of changing in climate, that kind of thing. And so I think you would find a number of parts of the financial services sector that would broadly be supportive because they think it's good economic policy as well as social policy. And I guess the third, again, thinking about it from the standpoint of the insurance industry and other parts of the financial services sector, cap and trade has a number of appeals to it. One is that it is certainly market-based. Secondly, setting a cap gives you a broad direction where you're headed. And third, to pick up a point that has come up a few times, I think broadly, if we think about this as an international problem, cap and trade, as you've already observed, may have the advantages of being something that can be applied successfully across a number of political jurisdictions. And so, looking at the industry I represent broadly, which is finance and insurance, I think you'd find many people supporting these directions.
Now, one of the things that when our energy team gets together, we talk about is that the lowest hanging fruit, the area where technology is already available, is on the efficiency side. We don't need breakthroughs as much as we just need the proper incentives to take advantage of that. And so I wanted to maybe just talk about that for a moment. And I'd be interested, Penny, from a real estate perspective, because buildings, it turns out, alongside cars is the area where there's just enormous waste. On the other hand, the real estate industry as a whole, residential and commercial, are obviously feeling enormous pressure right now. And so the question is whether there is an appetite for retrofitting old buildings, dealing with energy efficiency in what is already a difficult economic environment. Are there some additional things that we need to do if, in fact, we're going to move in that direction?
Mr. President, you're exactly right. The real estate industry is a large contributor to the production of emissions, and so something that we need to take into account, I think, to address this issue. I think given the stress that the commercial real estate industry is under, as well as the residential and housing market, I think we're going to need incentives to motivate people to be able to find the capital. It's very difficult to access capital for such retrofitting. And so I think there potentially needs to be some kind of incentive plan that might encourage activity now. Job creation comes with that at a time when the industry probably doesn't have the money or potentially the will. I don't think there's an aversion, or the industry is certainly not against this. It's a question of, is it realistic to get it done right now? So I think incentives are in order. It's enormously, I think you could put a lot of people to work doing this, because it's not only for the residential, but also large commercial buildings. There's enormous work to be done.
Carol, do you want to talk just briefly about some of the steps we're already taking on the efficiency front? And are there questions for this group that we're still puzzling over?
Well, on the efficiency front, I think many of you are aware that the President's Recovery Act did include about $6 billion for weatherization. That program is getting up and operating. We're seeing job creation across the country, very positive. To Penny's also are now starting to receive their block grants. And some of that money, depending on how states decide to use it, could be made available in terms of some of the commercial real estate and kind of efficiency investments in commercial real estate. Waxman Markey does include a renewables and an efficiency standard. What they've done is they've blended it together. Right now it's a total of 20% renewables, 5%, up to 8% can come from efficiencies. At least, so you could get a 12% renewables and an 8% efficiency. I think it was a carefully crafted provision to the bill. We'll see where it goes as the bill continues to move forward. But I think one of the things we've been interested in is, are there other steps we can take? Yesterday the President exercised his executive authority in proposing these national car standards, really historic level of reduction. Are there things we could do on the efficiency side? We understand some of the appliance things we can do, but there are other things you all are aware of where we have some executive authorities that the President could exercise. That would be very helpful to know.
John, did you want to comment on this?
There's two thoughts, and I think the most powerful one would be somehow to use your bully pulpit to get the nation's utilities to be rewarded just as much or more from saving electrons as they're now rewarded for producing electrons.
No, the California utilities have done some interesting work on
The
this.
California experience with this has been terrific.
Do you want to just describe that real quickly in case people aren't familiar with what they've done?
This program is called decoupling, and we know that our utilities right now are rewarded based on the return on their investment. So if we can get them to invest to reduce the demand for electricity, they're powerful engines in our economy. They have 100% market share. They touch every building, every consumer. They know how much energy everyone uses. They have very, very large cash flows, and they have very low cost of capital. Now let me connect that dot with the jobs opportunity. If you, through your authority or your influence or through further incentives, more than the $6 billion in the stimulus bill, said to each state, tell you what, if you adopt this decoupling, if you'll reward these utilities for saving electrons, and if so, I'll give you some federal incentive. With a small amount of federal money, you'll change their policies forever. And the beauty of the utilities is they're publicly accountable, and they can very rapidly employ across our nation 1 million out-of-work construction workers to go insulate homes, for example. And once we're insulating our homes and our offices, we're no longer taking American wealth and tossing it into the air by trying to heat the atmosphere, which is a really dumb idea. That money instead goes into the economy and creates jobs, and people buy services as opposed to trying to heat or cool the great outdoors. So using these incentives to change the rules of the road, and particularly of those for utilities, I think Carol would agree, has enormous impact. We've done a little. We can do a lot more. We can do it quickly, and they can create a lot of jobs.
Let me bring in some of the folks who I haven't had a chance to hear from. Robert, any thoughts of this from a banking perspective?
Well, I would just say that, we're contemplating here a market-based solution on cap and trade, and I would just say we have seen in the over-the-counter and exchange-traded markets that we have to make sure that there are disciplined regulatory reforms, that we understand the disclosure requirements, that it's globally coordinated. I mean, we don't want to redo the OTC derivative problem we just came out of, or the credit crisis. So I would just say that, since we are going to use market-based discipline, we should be very thoughtful before we decide what exchange we go on, who can be the market participants. We saw during the energy crisis a year ago, when the market went from 50 to 150, that when you take a small asset class and you make it investable as an invested asset class and a tradable asset class, you have a lot of volatility and you may have inflation that shouldn't happen. So I would just say we have to be, I think we should fast forward it because of the importance, but I do think we should make sure that we understand what we're going to be trading and who are the participants, because as we know from what the industry I'm in, once we see something that's an openly traded free market, we will have many more participants than we thought. And I think we have to be very careful on it, therefore. And I know that we're going to add that to some of the language and something we're going to be sending you soon.
it's important. Larry, we've been talking about how we can, mechanisms to avoid some of the problems that Robert.
Absolutely, yes. No, we've been working very much to have the right kind of framework in so that the markets function in the right way, yes.
David, you got anything to add on this?
So I think that the discussion really underscores the importance of having healthy financial markets. I mean, we're talking about the big project finance opportunities and the fact that the big money's not there, but it's true on the other end of the spectrum too. A number of our venture capitalists, including John Doerr and his partners at Kleiner Perkins, are involved in clean tech investing. And in the venture capital world, it's unusual because it's far more capital intensive than a lot of the other activities that they pursue. But the fact that the IPO markets are dead or in remission or wherever they are, but the fact that they're not functioning really has a direct impact on the venture capital end of the spectrum as well. And so the sooner we heal these markets, the better for our energy policies.
There's some ideas around the stimulus around an energy bank, to get back to Mark's point earlier, that I think business would invest side by side. I think that's the way to accelerate some of these projects, is to get the financing for big projects going forward. And I think not in a stimulus way, in terms of just purely government, but taking an energy bank, quote unquote, and allowing private business to invest side by side on these projects, whether it's smart grid or wind power, any of those. I think that could be a stimulative impact to get that going. I know some of those discussions have been going on with the Department of Energy. And then beyond that, just ramping up the XM to get behind some of these products as we globalize. I think that's another tool that we've got to get things going faster.
Right. Monica, do you want to talk about this from a small business perspective? Are you seeing an interest among small businesses and on the energy front? Yeah, I've seen some small businesses that are starting to take advantage of some of the retrofitting and weatherization opportunities.
Just two things I would say. They're productive jobs. And a lot of the workers that have been displaced from manufacturing and construction find this an area where they see great opportunity. So we need to provide not just the retraining and the capacity building for those sorts of jobs. This is a gateway to middle class work. And so as you've said, in fact, Mr. President, these jobs can cover a fairly wide gamut, and small business is looking particularly at this area because of the great focus on it. So one, from the point of view of retraining and job creation that leads to middle class work, I think is really important. The other one are the incentives for small businesses to begin to participate in the opportunities. Clearly there's a lot of incentive for large business. The financial markets are going to be working at it. Small business needs to feel that there is an opportunity for them to participate. The stimulus package, a lot of the money has to go out in the next 2 years. There's a general feeling that if you don't have the capacity to partake, you're going to be left behind, and so they're looking for partnerships between small and large business that can actually bring them to the table to access this opportunity. So those would be the two things. One is the job creation that leads to good middle class work, and the second one is the incentive for small business to actually participate in partnership with the large businesses.
What I'd like to do, I think, how much time do we have? I think we have probably about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. What I'd like to do is broaden the conversation a little bit. I want to make sure that Charles and Anna, Laura, I haven't heard from you guys, so feel free to, Bill, feel free to talk about energy. But Monica offers actually a pretty good segue. One of the things that we're wrestling with is how do we deal with job creation and employment. We expect that, well, I'm not making any predictions here because this is being web streamed. We expect that there's going to be some stabilizing of the economy, that the contraction start to turn again. But as all of you know, employment's a lagging indicator. We have shed a huge number of jobs during this deleveraging period. And the concern that we have is even in a stabilized situation, there's the prospect of higher unemployment for some time to come. And so I've been really pushing my economic team around the issue of job creation. And alongside the issue of job creation, being able to create career paths for people so that they're upgrading their jobs and upgrading their incomes. Because one of the problems that we saw during the 90s, even with very low unemployment and robust job creation, what you weren't seeing was significant increases in real incomes. So those are two areas that we're spending a lot of time thinking about. Clean energy is obviously a huge opportunity for job creation. We've talked about that, but if people want to broaden it into some other areas or give us suggestions of things we should be looking at that you haven't been seeing us look at or pay as much attention to, that would be helpful. So, Charles, you want to start with it?
Sure. I'll tie it to energy because the technology industry, everything we make uses energy 24/7. So we need a lot of power. And I think what's changed over the last 5 years is we used to design data centers with computers in them, and we did that based on where network access points were. And our customers over time have come to us and said, these things use too much power, the cost of energy is going up. So what has changed now is they care about power. And so it's forced us to design products differently. So I think it's a great example if the right incentives are in place that people will respond with innovation. So we design products now where computers share power supplies, for instance, and we design chips differently. But the power needs of the technology industry, and it affects all industries because they all rely on their products, it's only going to increase because the chips are getting faster, they dissipate more heat, if designing things closer together, they need more power. Same thing with storage, growing 50% a year. We keep the data longer because of compliance issues, you can't get rid of data anymore. So this is going to be an issue for a long period of time to come, and it's becoming a constraint to the growth of the technology industry because we are 100% power dependent. And so we're always looking for alternative sources. And so if we can go from 3% to 10% of some alternative sources of energy, that actually adds a lot of flexibility in how you deploy computing and how you build data centers. But no one talked about this 5 years ago, and now every single conversation before people can decide where to build a data center, they want to know how they're going to get the power.
So it's not just my 10-year-old daughter keeping her iPod plugged in and not taking it out of the socket. That's just one small manifestation of a larger problem.
Right, and ours have to stay on 24/7, so
Yeah.
we consume a lot of power. And so if we can get alternative sources, I think it actually opens up growth for our industry.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Anna?
So I think that it's pretty clear that moving to a low-carbon green economy can create lots of jobs. The question whether there'll be good jobs or bad jobs is still a question, and I think what we do about it can have an impact. I think it's also going to cause a huge transition. We will be creating jobs, we'll be changing jobs, and some people will be losing jobs. And we need a plan for that transition. I think that the Vice President's Task Force on the Middle Class, their first hearing in Philadelphia was about green energy and green jobs, actually had the same finding that our Change the Wind Federation report had, which are that we need to really think about how to make these jobs good jobs. Otherwise, they won't be. There's a UN report that does the same basic thing that says we really need to think about training, how to transition this. Part of it is the whole ideas of training, and I think it's great that there's money in the Recovery Act for training, because we really need to figure out how to make sure that people in the communities have access to training, so it becomes a job entry point, a job transition point, and a movement into good jobs. I also think that we need to really think about how to make sure that workers have a voice in the job. What we found, what the Vice President found, what the UN and the ILO found, and what we found was, generally speaking, the jobs that were good jobs in green energy were union jobs. Those that weren't were not. And there are lots of exploitation in workers that we can deal with in terms of how the jobs are structured, how the grants are provided, and what the government's role is. And so as we move forward, I think that your leadership in bringing business and labor and government together to say, how do we collectively solve this, is exactly what we need to do here in our country, but in partnership around the world. Because whatever we do is going to have a rippling impact, or whatever they do is going to have an impact on us. And if we really can bring this real partnership together that is about what's good for workers, what's good for business, what's good for our government, what's good for the future of our planet, that it will force us to change our behavior and really have an impact short-term and long-term. And so I just want to end with 3 quick examples, and just some things that we can do now in terms of, real estate and commercial properties. When workers have a voice, they can actually have ideas about how they can do things better. So our local in New York and California now bargain energy standards. And so energy efficiency standards. They have a whole training program where they train their janitors and their engineers in terms of how to retrofit, how to save energy. And they actually set a goal in their contract about saving 20% of the energy in their buildings through a certain period of time. They've now started a whole recycling, which they do not only for their business, the buildings itself, but also for their tenants, which is another way of doing that. The work that's been done in California around the LA ports, because we all know that the air pollution from the ports across our country is terrible. It's bad for the community, it's bad for our planet, it's bad for our kids with asthma, and it's bad for the truck drivers. And so how do we restructure that? The partnership that's gone on between the environmental communities, the truck drivers with the Teamsters, and the larger, broader community has really come up with a new model that will have energy efficient trucks, which will be good for the workers, good for the community, and a way of being able to do that.
Trucks that aren't just sitting there idling.
And not just in there, so in changing the whole mechanism of how you do it is important. There's a school in Washington State, I think now, where the janitors came up with a program with the kids, where they just now ended up lowering the energy use, recycling. The laborers are doing a program in New Jersey where they're really doing a training program that is recruiting from the communities. And so it's not leaving poor people behind. We really need to figure out, as we create jobs, how do we have a pathway for people who are without jobs to give them an opportunity to step up, have a job with a real skill. And how we do that through the weatherization programs can have a long-term impact. I think that there are lots of ways, if people, the public workers can get together and talk a lot about what they could do to retrofit their buildings, to have better energy practices, to really think about greening it. So I think that this partnership opportunity is here because you're leading it. And I think that if we all got to come together, we can actually move this forward.
Good. Bill, any thoughts on some of the general questions that we've been asking? You've got obviously experience in regulating big markets. We're looking at creating a market here. Robert raised some questions about the potential problems involved. I'd be interested in your views on that.
Well, obviously there are some major changes that have to be made in the whole regulatory system and the way our markets operate. If I can divert from that a little bit, I think there's your use of the bully pulpit to convince people that the energy situation is going to be a focus of the government. I think that can be used to stimulate the entrepreneurial desires of people out there. There are lots of small businessmen, venture capital type people who will see, if they're convinced it's a long-term program, will see opportunities to put businesses together. So I'm focused on that great mass of small business people out there who can divert what they're doing now into this area of, the opportunity to go into the housing market and buy a defunct house and fix it up. I think there's going to be businesses developed to do that. And so I'm looking at from the bottom up. There's going to be plenty of stuff from the top down, but mainly people have to be convinced that it's going to be an opportunity that's not going to go away. It's going to be a focus for a long period of time.
Just to add to what Bill said, Mr. President, I think not just on energy, but to take pride in being a productive technology and manufacturing base. You mentioned middle-class jobs. The best middle-class jobs we have in this country are manufacturing jobs. And I think a long-term notion that we would go gently into a service economy that's been held over the last 30 years, I just think hasn't worked. And so I think that is another piece that we have to work on. Rich and I don't agree on anything, fundamentally, right? We wake up in the morning disagreeing on about everything there is to disagree on. But I think the one thing we agree on is that we ought to create a sense of ownership and pride about a very productive, high-tech manufacturing base in this country. That may be, Rich, that may be the one.
But for those of us who work in the service industries, like education or healthcare, we don't want to knock that too much.
No, I'm not knocking that, Marty.
That's been the only thing that provided jobs.
I just think
recently.
there's going to have to be some balance over
Jeff.
time, and we're in both of them.
Jeff,
We're in services
if I
and
could just-
manufacturing.
One thing, I think it's, obviously growth in manufacturing is critical, but we should realize that finance, insurance, real estate, which is called the acronym FIRE, unfortunately, we've lost over 500,000 jobs in a year and a half. That's 10% of all jobs lost. So I know that we have to focus on the labor and the middle class and how to gain manufacturing, but we have been a growth and service industry for a decade that we've lost, as Laura said, 10% plus of
I
our
think we
jobs.
need
So I think you need that balance of both sides.
When I came to work for GE in 1982.
It'll increase our productivity rate.
Increase our productivity.
Well, I think the fact that some really good math whiz kids are going into engineering as opposed to derivatives is not a terrible thing.
Well, unless they're going to be
Fewer
carbon
financial
trading.
engineers and more real engineers.
Yeah, but I think that there's no doubt that manufacturing is not going to return to the share of the economy that it was in the 1950s, regardless of what our policies are, just because our manufacturing is extraordinarily efficient compared to what it was. On the other hand, what is true is that if we are going to at least have a larger element of exports, for example, as a proportion of our economy, which I think we're going to need. We've had this idea that we can just be the consumers of everything and not and borrow and spend. And at some point, we got to start selling something. Some of that is going to have to be top-notch products. Some of it will be services, and that helps our current economy as well. But if on energy, for example, we're just importing Spanish windmills or wind turbines, as opposed to some that are made here in the United States, that would be a shame. And I think we need to take advantage of that. Penny, you wanted to jump in on
I
this?
just wanted to underscore something Anna said. We've had some of the best innovation in terms of clean activities in our hotels coming from our employees. And it's come from the bottom up. We challenged our employee base to come up with creative ideas of how to do cleaning without using chemicals, how to better recycle, how to use less. And so I think there's a really interesting opportunity to use the bully pulpit and to highlight how the partnerships are working at the local level in some very major
Tell them
industries.
some good stories.
And to really celebrate that and raise the pride as to this is really an important endeavor in our country.
Laura, I wanted to get you in here, and you're a wonderful generalist as well as a specialist. One thing I was interested in is how this fits into what you're seeing internationally, because there is a concern voiced by Rich, but I suspect Jim and others are going to be concerned about if we're moving in an area where, as Marty said, there are going to be some increased costs related to this, and if we don't see some concerted action on the other side, we're going to be placed at a competitive disadvantage.
I would tie it back to the beginning of the conversation. I think that it's really important to go to Copenhagen from a leadership position, because if we try to do something on our own, or if Europe tries to do something on its own, but we don't get emerging market buy-in, we will end up in a world where we're going to have carbon tariffs, compensating, border offsetting, border interventions in trade, things which we would be much better off in terms of efficiency and getting a global outcome on carbon to get a global agreement. So my first thing is, let's really move towards that as a way to hold off a much worse situation where we don't have a global solution and we have a bunch of trading restrictions that intervene. So that would be my first point. My second point, thinking about it in terms of a couple other trade policy areas. I think there has been, someone raised already, it's been raised in the jobs group, looking more at what we can do with EXIM as a way to promote our exports. It gets to the issue of the small and medium-sized businesses in the following sense. I mean, the truth about employment in the United States over the next decade is the same truth about employment in the last decade. It's primarily small and medium-sized businesses, whether it's goods or services, and it is going to be primarily services. It is not the case that, so our jobs task force is going to have to look at high wage strategies for services as well as for manufacturing. And I'm perfectly sympathetic, absolutely completely sympathetic with the view of building as much as we can, strengthening our manufacturing base. But that will be leaving the share of manufacturing probably steady, the share of manufacturing employment and total employment probably continuing down. So I think we have to be realistic about the jobs and say, okay, we want to really build the strength of our manufacturing exports in our manufacturing sector, and that will create wonderful jobs throughout the economy. So Ex-Im Bank and what we do Ex-Im Bank becomes an issue for manufacturing and exports. But also, I think we have to be very careful. One of the things that I've been concerned about looking around the world is a lot of countries, most countries now, who are our competitors, are talking about the importance of green energy and green jobs. And some of them have a head start on us. And you know, there are embedded in a lot of what they're doing local content restrictions. That is, in order to serve the green economy of the home country, you require local content provision of that service. Now, some of this is local content by definition. I mean, utility is a local content. Refurbishing a home is a local content. Where you buy a wind turbine is not local content. Do you make it? So I think we have to be very careful. There's a whole set of trade-related issues around the development of this green economy that we're going to have to keep track of. The last thing I'll just say is that we are working we've just started to work with the manufacturing task force, and we already, despite what I said about, I'm not convinced we can have a significant change in the trajectory of manufacturing jobs, but I think we can do a tremendous amount to strengthen U.S. manufacturing as a sector, and we will be working with that task force. And one of the first things that came up, interestingly enough, is this issue of how you help the small and medium-sized business sector that I said is very important in manufacturing access the programs and policies of the U.S. government. We are spending, the stimulus bill is a massive investment by the government in the U.S. economy. It is much harder for small and medium-sized businesses to access that support. And we need to think very carefully about, can we get that better? So that's going to be one of the focuses of the effort.
We're out of time. Jim, you want to jump in real quick. Mark, you want to jump in, and then Paul, I'd let you wrap up.
I'll be just very brief. One of the things we don't forget is that small and medium-sized companies are big suppliers of Jeff and myself. Roughly, for every job we have, there are 3 jobs at small, medium-sized company suppliers feeding us. We exported, for example, last year, $16 billion worth of product. So a lot of our small, medium-sized companies don't know they're exporters, but they're exporters. And it's very important that we continue to look at global manufacturing competitiveness. And I think as a country, if we're going to be a great country 20, 30 years from now, we've got to shift the paradigm a little bit here. We've got to save more and invest more and export more. We can't have the U.S. consumer and the huge deficits. You asked about what do we have to do structurally different going forward. That's one of the reset buttons we've got to hit, and that's a tough one. It's tough for political leaders to help bring about that change, and I think the business community has got to be part of helping the public understand we've got to save more, invest more, and grow our international competitiveness is a key to our future success.
I was just going to add something that follow on Laura said. If you think about the competitive dynamic internationally for green, since other parts of the world are just growing their demand for energy just much faster than we are, so China's high single digits, low double digits, and because they have a centralized authority that can allow for example, a smart grid being put in place much faster than we can. Those two things will naturally result in them developing better technologies faster because their home market actually has more demand. So we're fighting a fight that will require us to be more on our game than we have to be in a general sense because they have a natural, clear advantage both governmentally and demand-wise.
Paul?
Well, I think you've seen a remarkable degree of consensus in this
Not bad.
variegated group on this particular problem. I'm not going to add anything on the technical side, but let me just make 2 points on this issue. It's going to take, does involve some costs, it's going to take a lot of investment over time. But one thing I'm sure of, we got room for that investment. When this economy normalizes and the financial markets normalize, Jim is quite right. We can't live on consumption. We've got to fill up that hole in consumption with investment, which will make us more internationally competitive. And I don't have any doubt that this is going to be a good thing in terms of supporting economic activity. The only other point I make, all the time this is discussed and the cost, there isn't enough emphasis, it seems to me, on the cost of what happens if we don't do anything. If any of these projections are halfway correct, it's going to cost amounts of money that make this stuff we're talking about trivial. And I don't think that that's impressed enough upon, I know it's out in the distance, so it's hard politically, but there it is. And I just don't
I haven't found anything that was easy politically yet, so.
We'll produce that at the next meeting.
I'm sure I speak for the whole group. We've been very excited. It's been a real unique opportunity, I think, for the government, but also for us to get to know each other and to have this outside perspective. Our ability to operate as an advisory committee does depend on coming up with things that are of interest to you and to top, policymakers. So if you ever have subjects, or Christy, Carol, Larry, if you guys ever have subjects you want to hear from us, if you convey them to our illustrious chairman or to me or to any of us, that helps us do our work.
Well, you guys have done a terrific job. Obviously, there have been a bunch of smaller groups that are working intensively with our economic team. You've got 5 or 6 things already on the plate. This has been extraordinarily helpful. I appreciate all of you coming in. If you can keep your seats just for a moment, we're going to bring a pool spray in just to record who it is that was in the meeting, although we've had some press folks in here taking assiduous notes, I'm sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think
Hello, everybody. Well, you will have a record of everything that was said here, so we don't need to repeat it. I just want to publicly thank this group, chaired by Paul Volcker, staffed by Austin Goolsby. They are doing extraordinary work, separate and apart from meetings with me, on a whole range of issues. We talked about energy today, but they are helping to advise us in our approach to the financial regulatory regime that we are looking to put before Congress this year. They are helping us in thinking about employment, manufacturing. There is a whole host of issues that this group is providing wonderful expertise for. And interestingly enough, as Paul mentioned at the end of this discussion, there is impressive consensus, not perfect consensus, but an impressive overlap of views about the importance of us getting out front on energy, the enormous job creation potential that exists, the requirements to create a more efficient energy system in order for us to remain competitive. And I'm excited about the opportunities. We've seen some great progress this week. We're going to see more because of the contributions that are made around this table. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.